Red, White, and Radical, the podcast, is based on the book Red, White, and Radical, What Organizations Can Learn About Change from the Rise of American Conservatism. You can get it from the publisher Routledge and in Amazon and other online stores.
Welcome to Red, White, and Radical, a podcast that explores how American conservatism has changed the world. I'm Warwick Harneys, and in part 1, I tell the story of how Philip Morris and the tobacco industry invented freedom of consumer choice.
It's interesting that in the 1950s, if you would have asked people what should be done if cigarettes cause cancer, the almost universal answer would be they should be banned. The genius of the tobacco industry was essentially inventing personal choice as an excuse to keep selling cigarettes.
That's Robert Proctor, professor of the history of science at Stanford University, who's phoned in from California. Robert's the author of Golden Holocaust, the most comprehensive history of the tobacco industry ever written. There's lots more insight from him to come.
Personal choice is all about putting the agency in the hands of the individual consumer and exonerating the manufacturer. The tobacco industry were able to not only engineer their own survival, but create an entire philosophical mood or context that basically put the blame on the individual.
That philosophical context is libertarianism, the idea that people should be free to live their lives as they choose, without interference from a meddling nanny state. Big Tobacco's remarkable contribution to libertarianism is a powerful argument about consumer culture. Freedom of choice comes with a disclaimer that an individual accepts responsibility for the risks associated with their choices.
Some risk of dependency.
In this episode, I explain how Big Tobacco's cunning and the unparalleled success of Marlboro lit the spark of opportunity. Today, libertarian consumer culture is part of the fibre of America. It's the Marlboro legacy.
Tobacco is a dirty weed, I like it. It satisfies our normal need, I like it.
To understand how the tobacco industry laid the foundations for freedom of consumer choice, we need to answer 3 questions. Why are cigarettes so popular? Why does someone start smoking in the first place? And how did Marlboro become the most successful consumer brand of all time?
The 3 roots of the cigarette epidemic are mass production, mass marketing, and then mass deception. Mechanization of manufacture allowed them to become a kind of everyman product, this sort of fast food of tobacco.
Cigarettes became the most popular tobacco product in the early 20th century, partly because they were cheaper and easier to produce than cigars and pipe tobacco. It was possible to make supply meet the massive demand. But why was the demand for cigarettes so much higher than the demand for, say, cigars? It's chemistry that explains why people find it so hard to stop smoking cigarettes once they've started.
Cigarettes are addictive. They're as addictive as heroin and cocaine.
Cigarettes are addictive because of the way the tobacco is cured. After the leaves are harvested, they're hung in barns to dry. This treatment makes their smoke alkaline, which, unlike pipe or cigar smoke, makes it possible to inhale. Inhaling tobacco smoke lets nicotine be absorbed into the bloodstream, and that makes cigarettes extremely addictive. So it's not surprising that demand for cigarettes spread like wildfire in the first half of the 20th century. Where there's demand, there's competition, and the tobacco industry was fiercely competitive. For the tobacco companies, this was a double-edged sword. It was great that cigarettes were addictive, but try as they might, they couldn't find a way to differentiate tobacco. Despite intense research and development efforts to make their tobacco taste unique, blind tests consistently showed that smokers found it impossible to tell their brand from the next. Tobacco was just an addictive commodity. Commodities are cheap, so a commodity market constantly requires new customers to make it sustainable. Tobacco companies needed to understand why people start smoking in the first place.
Remember, the cigarette epidemic is a pediatric disease. People begin as children. It's very rare for someone to start smoking even in their 20s. And so they need the child to be attracted, and it's by trying to be an adult. People have never started smoking in order to look younger.
In an effort to understand more about why teenagers smoke, the author Malcolm Gladwell asked people about their first cigarette experiences. Their responses have a lyrical beauty to them.
My mother smoked, and when she smoked, she looked so elegant and devil-may-care that there was no question that I'd smoke someday. She thought people who didn't smoke were kinda gutless.
The first kid I knew who smoked was Billy G. He was the first kid to date girls, smoke cigarettes and pot, drink hard alcohol, and listen to druggy music. The draw for me was the badness and the adultness of it.
The first person who I remember smoking was a girl named Pam. We used to sit in the back of the bus and blow smoke out the window. She taught me how to inhale, how to tie a man-tailored shirt up the waist to look cool, and how to wear lipstick. She had a leather jacket. Her father was rarely home.
There's a certain type of person who introduces other people to cigarettes. They're social, rebellious, sexually impulsive, indifferent to the opinions of others. They like risk-taking and thrill-seeking. They're exciting. People start smoking because other people smoke. Smoking was cool because smokers were cool.
The cigarette makers love to talk about peer pressure, and that the true cause of smoking is not anything they do, not advertising, not marketing. It's peer pressure. But if you look at their secret documents, we now have 90 million pages of their formerly secret documents that have been made available through litigation. We find that their whole strategy has been to create peer pressure.
How do you reliably create peer pressure?
They realize that they need to create a culture of acceptability, a material culture. It used to be, not so long ago, that every house would have an ashtray, and hospitals had ashtrays, and you could smoke almost everywhere. The male shirt pocket, that just fits the cigarette lighter that's in every car, the cigarette ashtray that was on every plane. That was all part of that effort to insinuate the material culture into daily life. And as their top people used to say, the cigarette itself was its own advertisement, basically creating a cigarette-friendly world that allows them to keep selling cigarettes unimpeded.
As business strategies go, it was ingenious and lucrative. By mid-century, cigarettes accounted for 1.4% of US gross national product, around $164 billion a year in today's money. 42% of Americans smoked, and they smoked a lot, on average a pack a day. Peer pressure in a cigarette-friendly world had made America smoke more than any other country in the world. At this time, Philip Morris was the smallest of the 6 major cigarette companies. They desperately needed a best-selling brand. The top 3 brands, Camel, Lucky Strike and Chesterfield, were all associated with urban sophistication. Doctors smoked Camels, socialites smoked Luckies, celebrities smoked Chesterfields.
More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Then, the Surgeon General hit the world with an inconvenient truth. Medical science had conclusively proved that cigarettes kill. Philip Morris saw the writing on the wall. Well-educated, health-conscious urbanites would ditch the habit in droves, decimating demand for the top brands, all of which were unfiltered, rich-tasting cigarettes.
Cigarettes used to be a luxury product smoked by dandies and the elite in urban areas. It remains a relative luxury until the 1960s, which is you get what I call the grand tilt. Prior to the 1960s, you're more likely to smoke if you're a doctor than you're not a doctor. You're more likely to smoke if you're a professor or an intellectual or a titan of industry. After the 60s, with the proof of deadly harm, the cigarette industry realizes their business is with the less educated, the more vulnerable population. Or even as R.J. Reynolds put it quite crudely at one point, we don't smoke that shit. We reserve that for the poor, the black, and the stupid. So they realize that their future is really in the downtrodden, the mentally ill, and the poor, and so forth. And they actually deliberately target the less educated.
Philip Morris would steal a march on the competition by creating a brand that reassured working Americans it was still safe to smoke. They'd argue that filter tips removed the deadly toxins in tobacco smoke, and they already had a brand in mind. Marlboro had started life as a niche cigarette for women. It pioneered the use of filter tips, but wasn't very popular. It was perfect for a macho makeover. To combat the perception that filters were for wimps, they designed a durable, crush-proof cardboard flip-top carton that would communicate strength. They created the Marlboro crest, which signified quality and prestige, and used bold red accents to make the packaging stand out on the shelves and suggest festivity and enjoyment. But that wasn't enough. They wanted to create a hero who could personify the new brand. If consumers identified with an invincible strongman, they could convince themselves that they too might be resistant to disease. He'd need to be brave, honest, and all-American. He should embody self-reliance and freedom.
New snow and good hunting up there, up in Marlboro country.
To invent this mythical man, Philip Morris sought the help of advertising maestro Leo Burnett. He had a reputation for fashioning romantic visions of the American heartland in his work, influenced by his upbringing.
In the Michigan town where I was raised, you could hear the calm growing on hot nights. I snuck up on Chicago slowly by way of outlying cities. When I finally got there, I was 40 years old and confirmed in my colloquial ways.
Competitors criticized Burnett as unsophisticated and childish, which is exactly what Philip Morris wanted. He kept a folder on his desk in which he'd scribble corny language. He disliked data and let intuition guide his creative decisions. He understood that history, mythology, and folklore were the richest sources for branding and advertising ideas. Burnett put his creative director, Draper Daniels, in charge of the Marlboro account. If the name sounds familiar, that's probably because he was the inspiration for the TV show Mad Men's lead character, Don Draper. Draper Daniels was the best, but even the best get things wrong. Daniels and his team originally proposed to make the Marlboro Man a cab driver, until Leo himself whipped out a magazine with a cowboy on the cover and said,
"The cowboy is a universal symbol of admired masculinity."
So Draper Daniels and his team trawled working farms looking for a real-life cowboy around whom they could build a persona. Eventually, they found Darrell Winfield on a ranch in Wyoming. He scared the hell out of them, and they knew they'd found their man. Winfield became the most used model from a team of 4 real cowboys who portrayed the Marlboro Man in the brand's golden era of advertising, from the 1960s to the 1990s. Brand rules as complex as the Marlboro world was simple were created to guide photographers and marketeers.
To make the Marlboro Man believable, we must understand who he is and what he does. We must get to know him well enough to describe him accurately and to make people believe in him. He's a special kind of man. Strong, he's tough, and he's self-reliant. He is a boss who leads by example, who is followed by choice. He works in a place called Marlboro country.
The Leo Burnett team set out to chronicle the modern American West, telling timeless stories with visual vignettes about the cowboy's life. Like The Simpsons, Marlboro appealed to kids and adults alike. The Marlboro Man made adults daydream like children and made children fantasize about being all grown up.
There were studies that were done showing that of all symbols, the horse was the symbol that best broke the parent-child bond, that the horse would be the symbol of freedom. And that's what the cigarette industry always needed, was some way to create this semblance of adulthood for children. The cowboy was the image that allowed the girl to become a woman, the boy to become a man. And that was deliberate, and that was genius, and that's, as you say, why the Marlboro has become not just the leading selling cigarette globally, but probably the best selling consumer product in the history of the world.
Peer pressure in a cigarette-friendly world made people start smoking, and an all-American hero encouraged them to choose Marlboro even after it was proved that smoking kills. Philip Morris had decisively won the battle for market supremacy, but they didn't stop there. It was nicotine that made cigarettes hard to quit. If tobacco was just an addictive commodity, well, maybe a further edge could be gained if it could be made even more addictive. Long before junkies were freebasing cocaine to create crack, Philip Morris began freebasing the tobacco that went into Marlboro cigarettes.
Philip Morris has always been, well, at least for 50 years, has been a step ahead of the other companies, creating this genius product. It's the first free-based cigarette using diammonium phosphate. Millions of pounds of ammonia are added to cigarettes every year in order to freebase the nicotine molecule, making it a perfect invention of Philip Morris from the early 1960s. It's a mixture of that alkaloid genius, that chemical genius, with the Marlboro Man, the Marlboro Country campaign, which identified the cigarette with freedom, the freedom of the great American West. No one gets cancer in Monument Valley. Cowboys don't get cancer, and there's no cancer sitting around the campfire with your beans and your barbecue.
By the early 1970s, Marlboro was the most popular cigarette brand in the world, and it remains so today. Chemistry and a cowboy made it so.
Come to where the flavor is. Famous Marlboro Red or new Marlboro 100s, the Longhorns. Come to Marlboro Country.
Next time on Red, White and Radical, I look at how big tobacco used patriotism to help resist efforts to ban cigarettes in America.
The cigarette industry really, by the 1980s, is trying to wrap themselves in the flags of patriotism. And so cigarettes become an expression of freedom. Anyone who says anything against the cigarette is a tyrant or is a nanny state shower adjuster.